On the morning of September 14th, 1902, a man walked out of the White Mountains of New Hampshire alone. His name was Daniel Carver. He was 31 years old, a surveyor by trade, employed by the Boston and Maine Railroad. He had entered those mountains 6 days earlier with 4 other men. When he emerged, he was the only one still breathing. The constable in North Woodstock, a man named Ephraim Cole, recorded the encounter in his daily log. The entry is brief, almost clerical, but it contains a detail that would echo through depositions, newspaper columns, and family letters for decades to come. Mr. Carver appeared at the station house at approximately 8:15 a.m. He was in fair physical condition, though his boots were badly worn and his trousers torn at the knee. When asked the whereabouts of the others, he did not reply. When pressed, he said only, "They didn't make it." When asked how they died, he turned his face to the wall and would say nothing further. Daniel Carver never did say anything further, not to the constable, not to the railroad investigators, not to the coroner's inquest that convened 3 weeks later in Concord, not to the widows, the siblings, the parents who came to him with photographs and pleading eyes, asking only to know how their men had spent their final hours. He refused them all. The historian's task, then, is not to uncover what Daniel Carver saw. It is to understand why he believed silence was the only mercy he had left to give. By the time Carver arrived in North Woodstock that September morning, the search parties had already been dispatched. 2 days earlier, when the survey crew failed to return to their logging camp on schedule, the camp foreman had sent riders to the nearest towns. The White Mountains were unforgiving that time of year. Early autumn, when the weather could turn in an afternoon and fog could swallow a trail whole. But Carver had not been lost. He knew exactly where he'd been. He simply would not say. The constable's log continues. I offered him water and bread. He took both without comment. I asked if he required medical attention. He shook his head. I asked if he knew where the bodies were. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, I know. I asked if he would take us to them. He said, no. That single word, no, became the foundation of everything that followed. The bodies were eventually found 11 days later by a team of experienced woodsmen hired by the railroad. They were located in a narrow ravine approximately 4 miles northeast of the survey site, clustered together in what the lead searcher described as an almost deliberate arrangement, as though they had been laid to rest rather than fallen. 3 had died from exposure. The 4th, a man named Peter Hollis, had sustained a head injury consistent with a fall. None of this information came from Daniel Carver. What we know of Carver before the incident comes largely from employment records and the testimony of those who worked alongside him. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the best sense of the word. Steady, competent, not given to drink or gambling. He had grown up in Portland, Maine, the second of 4 sons. His father was a shipwright. His mother died when Daniel was 12. He had joined the railroad survey teams in 1897, after spending several years working freight routes through Vermont. His supervisor, a man named Augustus Lyle, described him in a letter to the company as dependable and even-tempered, with a good eye for terrain. There is no record of Daniel Carver ever having caused trouble. And yet in the weeks following his return, he became the subject of intense scrutiny. Not because he had done anything wrong, there was never any formal accusation, but because his silence suggested he had something to hide. Human nature abhors a vacuum. Where facts are absent, suspicion rushes in to fill the space. The widows wanted answers. The railroad wanted to close the case. The newspapers wanted a story. And Daniel Carver wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He returned to his boarding house in Concord and did not leave it for 3 weeks. The landlady, Mrs. Abigail Frost, later told a reporter that Carver spent most of his time sitting by the window, watching the street. He ate little. He did not read. When she asked if he needed anything, he thanked her politely and said he did not. I thought perhaps he was grieving, Mrs. Frost said. But it wasn't grief exactly. It was more like he was waiting for something, or deciding something. The inquest was held on October 6, 1902, in a second-floor courtroom that smelled of wood polish and damp wool. Daniel Carver was called to testify. He arrived on time, dressed in a clean shirt and a borrowed coat. He took the stand and placed his hand on the Bible without hesitation. The coroner, Dr. Nathaniel Ward, was a careful man. He began with simple questions. Mr. Carver, you were employed by the Boston and Maine Railroad as a surveyor. Is that correct? Yes. And on September 8th, you and 4 other men entered the White Mountains to survey a proposed rail extension? Yes. Can you describe the conditions that day? Carver paused. Then, clear, mild, no indication of trouble. And when did the trouble begin? Another pause. Longer this time. I can't say. You can't say, or you won't say. I won't. The courtroom fell silent. Dr. Ward leaned forward. Mr. Carver, 4 men are dead. Their families deserve to know how they died. Daniel Carver met his gaze without flinching. I understand that, he said quietly, but I can't help them. Can't or won't? Won't. It went on like this for nearly an hour. Dr. Ward tried persuasion, then frustration, then something close to pleading. He reminded Carver that withholding information could be construed as obstruction. He pointed out that the families had traveled great distances to attend the inquest. He suggested that Carver's silence might be interpreted as guilt. Carver absorbed it all without reaction. And when Dr. Ward finally asked, point blank, whether Carver had any reason to believe he was responsible for the deaths, Carver said, no. Then why won't you speak? Because, Carver said, some things are better left alone. The inquest concluded with no findings. The official cause of death for all 4 men was listed as exposure and misadventure. The case was closed. The families went home. The newspapers moved on to other tragedies. Daniel Carver returned to his boarding house and resumed his work with the railroad. But the silence followed him. It followed him through the winter of 1902, when he was reassigned to survey work in Vermont, far from the White Mountains. It followed him through the spring of 1903, when one of the widows, Margaret Hollis, Peter's wife, wrote him a letter begging him to tell her whether her husband had suffered. Carver did not reply. It followed him through the summer of 1904, when a journalist from the Boston Globe tracked him down and offered him $200 for an exclusive interview. Carver refused, and it followed him finally to the day he died. To understand the silence, one must first understand what was lost. The 4 men who died in the White Mountains were not strangers to Daniel Carver. They were his colleagues, his companions, his friends. They had worked together for months, sometimes years. They had shared meals, told stories, endured the boredom and discomfort of long days in rough country. They had trusted him. The first was James Whitmore, 43 years old, a senior surveyor with nearly 20 years' experience. Whitmore had a wife and 3 children in Portsmouth. He was known for his meticulous record-keeping and his habit of whistling hymns while he worked. In a letter to his wife, dated September 2, 1902, 6 days before the trip into the mountains, he wrote, Carver is proving himself a good hand, quiet but steady, the sort you want beside you when the work turns difficult. The second was Peter Hollis, 28, married less than a year. Hollis was newer to the work, but he was eager and strong. He had grown up in the mountains of Vermont and knew the woods better than most. His widow, Margaret, would later describe him as a man who laughed easily and loved hard. The third was Thomas Birch, 35, unmarried. Birch was the crew's cook and general laborer. He was not an educated man, but he was resourceful and good-natured. A fellow worker remembered him as the type who could start a fire in the rain and make a joke about it. The fourth was Samuel Kern, 51, the oldest of the group. Kern was a veteran of the survey crews, a man who had spent more time in the wilderness than in any town. He had no family to speak of, no permanent address. The mountains were his home. He was respected by the younger men for his knowledge and his calm demeanor. These were not faceless victims. They were men with histories, with people who loved them, with futures that ended in a ravine. And Daniel Carver had known them all. The survey expedition was routine. The Boston and Maine Railroad was expanding its reach into the northern wilderness, seeking routes that would connect logging camps to the main lines. It was dangerous work, but not unusually so. The crew had been assigned to map a 12-mile stretch of terrain between North Woodstock and the Pemigewasset River. They set out on the morning of September 8, 1902, from a logging camp operated by the Conway Timber Company. The camp foreman, a man named Henry Talbot, watched them go. He later testified that the weather was fair and that the men were in good spirits. Whitmore was talking about getting home in time for his daughter's birthday, Talbot said. Hollis was singing something. I don't recall what. Carver was quiet as usual, but he seemed fine. They all seemed fine. The plan was simple. Spend 5 days surveying the route, then return to the camp. They carried enough supplies for a week. They were experienced. They knew the risks. Nothing suggested what was coming. What happened in those 6 days remains, in most respects, unknown. But we can reconstruct fragments from the evidence that was later gathered. The survey crew followed a standard protocol. Each day they would establish a base camp, then spread out in pairs to measure distances, map elevations, and mark potential routes. At night, they would reconvene, compare notes, and plan the next day's work. For the first 3 days, everything proceeded as expected. We know this because the surveying equipment was later recovered and the notes were intact. Whitmore's handwriting fills the pages, neat columns of numbers, careful sketches of the terrain. The last entry is dated September 11th, 1902. After that, the record goes blank. What we know of the relationships within the crew comes from letters, interviews, and the testimony of others who had worked with them. Whitmore and Carver had developed a quiet respect. Whitmore appreciated Carver's competence. Carver valued Whitmore's experience. There is no evidence of friction between them. Hollis and Carver were closer in age and temperament. They had worked together on several prior surveys. A letter from Hollis to his wife, dated August 1902, mentions Carver in passing. Carver and I covered 6 miles today. He's good company, even if he doesn't say much. Birch, the cook, was well liked by everyone. In the informal hierarchy of the crew, he occupied a unique space, neither leader nor subordinate but essential. His role was to keep the men fed and the camp running smoothly. He did so without complaint. Kern, the eldest, was a figure of quiet authority. He had survived accidents, storms, and illnesses that had killed younger men. The others deferred to him in matters of wilderness survival. Carver, in particular, seemed to regard Kern with something close to reverence. In a letter to his brother, written in July 1902, Carver described Kern as the kind of man who makes you believe you'll be all right, even when you're not sure you will be. There is no evidence that any of these men disliked one another. There is no evidence of quarrels, resentments, or rivalries. If anything, the picture that emerges is one of camaraderie. And that, perhaps, is what makes the silence so unbearable. If Daniel Carver had hated these men, his refusal to speak might make a certain cruel sense. But he hadn't hated them. He had known them. He had shared their fire, their food, their stories, and yet he chose to let them disappear into history without a word. The last known sighting of the crew alive came from a trapper named Joseph Lund, who encountered them on the afternoon of September 10th. Lund was checking his lines near the Pemigewasset when he spotted the survey party setting up camp. He later testified that he exchanged a few words with Whitmore, who asked about the weather. Lund told them a storm was likely within the next day or two. Whitmore thanked him and offered him coffee. They seemed in good order, Lund said. No one was hurt. No one seemed anxious. Carver was standing a bit apart, looking at the sky. I remember thinking he looked like he was listening for something. Lund moved on. He never saw them again. The last confirmed moment the 5 men were together was the evening of September 11th, 1902. This is not speculation. This is established by the physical evidence, the surveying notes, the arrangement of the camp, the condition of the supplies when they were later recovered. Sometime after nightfall on September 11th, something happened. What that something was, we do not know. But by the morning of September 12th, the group had fractured. The search party that found the bodies in late September also found the remnants of 2 camps. The first was the main survey camp, located on a ridge overlooking the Pemigewasset. The second was smaller, situated approximately 2 miles to the northeast. in a dense stand of spruce. The main camp showed signs of hasty abandonment. The tent was still standing, but supplies had been left scattered. A cookpot sat overturned near the fire pit. One of the surveying tripods lay on its side, as though it had been knocked over in a hurry. The second camp was different. It was deliberate. The fire pit had been carefully constructed. The ground had been cleared of debris. There were marks in the soil suggesting someone had attempted to build a shelter. It was here, in this second camp, that the bodies were eventually found. But there was no evidence Daniel Carver had ever been there. The question that haunted the investigators and later the families was simple. Why did they separate? In wilderness survival, the cardinal rule is to stay together. A group has a far better chance of enduring hardship than an individual. Every man on that survey crew would have known this. And yet, at some point between the night of September 11th and the morning of September 14th, Daniel Carver left the others. Or the others left him. Or something happened that made staying together impossible. The coroner's report provides a few clinical details. All 4 men were found within a 15-foot radius of one another. Whitmore and Birch were lying near the fire pit. Kern was slumped against a tree. Hollis was several feet away, his body positioned as though he had been trying to crawl. The head injury that killed Hollis was consistent with a fall, but the report notes that the surrounding terrain did not suggest an obvious site for such a fall. The nearest cliff face was more than a quarter-mile away. Whitmore, Birch, and Kern had no visible injuries. They had simply stopped living. The medical examiner estimated they had been dead for approximately 48 hours when they were found. That would place their deaths around September 12th or 13th, well before Carver emerged from the mountains, which means Carver had been alone for at least a day, possibly 2, and he had chosen not to seek help until he was sure they were beyond it. One detail, small but troubling, appears in the notes of the lead searcher, a woodsman named Amos Pruitt. When the bodies were examined, it was noted that their personal effects were still intact. Watches, pocket knives, money, none of it had been taken. But one item was missing: Kern's compass. It was a distinctive piece, brass with an engraved lid, a gift from a railroad superintendent years earlier. Kern was known to carry it always. He had shown it to other men in the crew, including Carver. The compass was never found. Pruitt's notes include a single line of speculation. Carver may have taken it. No way to know. No reason to ask. But no one did ask. By the time the bodies were recovered, Daniel Carver had already made it clear he would not answer questions. There is one other fragment of evidence, cryptic and unverifiable, that surfaced years later. In 1911, a man named Arthur Goss, who had worked as a cook in the logging camps, told a story to a reporter from the Concord Monitor. Goss claimed he had spoken with Carver briefly in the fall of 1902, a few weeks after the inquest. According to Goss, Carver had been drinking, unusual for him, and had made a single offhand remark. He said, "Sometimes a man has to choose who gets to go home." Then he shut up and wouldn't say another word. The reporter pressed Goss for details. Goss couldn't provide any. He wasn't even certain of the exact date of the conversation. The story was never corroborated, but it lingered. In trying to reconstruct what happened during those lost days, the historian is forced to work with absence. We know where the men started. We know where they ended. But the space between is filled only with guesses. Did they encounter something? A storm? An injury? A misjudgment? That forced them to split up? Did Carver leave to seek help, only to return and find them dead? Did he refuse to go back because he knew there was nothing he could do? Or did something else happen, something that could not be explained without implicating himself? The investigators considered all these possibilities. None of them fit cleanly. If Carver had left to seek help, why not say so? It would have absolved him. If he had returned to find them dead, why not lead the search party to the bodies immediately? It would have saved time, spared the families days of anguish. And if he had done something, anything that he believed was wrong, why not confess? The inquest made it clear he was not suspected of murder. No one thought he had harmed them deliberately. The silence, then, was not the silence of guilt. It was the silence of something else. In the months following the inquest, Daniel Carver became a ghost in his own life. He continued to work for the railroad, but he was no longer sent into the field. Instead, he was reassigned to clerical duties in the Concord office, cataloging survey reports and updating maps. It was quiet work, solitary work. He performed it without complaint, but the pressure to speak did not relent. Margaret Hollis, Peter's widow, wrote to Carver in December 1902. The letter, preserved in a private collection, is heartbreaking in its restraint. Mr. Carver, it begins, I do not write to accuse you. I write only to ask for a kindness. My husband is gone, and I have made my peace with that. But I cannot make peace with not knowing. Did he suffer? Was he afraid? Did he speak of me? I do not ask you to relive what must have been a terrible time. I ask only for a small mercy, a single sentence, anything that might let me sleep at night. Please, Mr. Carver, please. Carver did not reply. Years later, Margaret Hollis would tell her daughter that the silence was, in its own way, an answer. But she never said what she believed that answer was. The railroad, too, applied pressure, though of a different kind. In January 1903, Augustus Lyle, Carver's former supervisor, summoned him to a meeting. The details of the conversation were never recorded, but Lyle later wrote to a colleague that he had attempted to impress upon Carver the importance of cooperation with the company's inquiry. Carver, Lyle wrote, had been polite, but immovable. The company considered dismissing him. Legally, they had little grounds. Carver had not been found negligent, and the inquest had cleared him of wrongdoing. But his continued silence was, as one executive put it, a liability to morale. In the end, they kept him on, perhaps out of fairness, perhaps because firing him would have required an explanation they were not prepared to give. Carver stayed in Concord, working his quiet job, speaking to no one about the mountains. The newspapers were less patient. For several weeks after the inquest, reporters hounded Carver. They waited outside his boarding house, followed him to work, approached him in the street. He ignored them all. One journalist, a man named Richard Morse, managed to corner Carver in a Concord cafe in November 1902. Morse later described the encounter in an article that ran in the Boston Globe. I asked him if he understood how his silence appeared to others. He said he did. I asked him if he cared. He said, not especially. I asked him if he had any regrets. He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, every day. I asked what he regretted. He stood up, paid for his coffee, and walked out. Morse never spoke to him again. By the spring of 1903, the public's interest had largely faded. There were other tragedies, other mysteries. The White Mountains swallowed men every year. 4 more names on the list of the missing did not hold the headlines for long. But the families did not forget, and neither did the men who had worked alongside Carver. In June 1903, a group of railroad surveyors, men who had known Whitmore, Hollis, Birch, and Kern, gathered at a tavern in Portsmouth. They sent a letter to Carver, signed by all of them. The letter was not angry. It was not accusatory. It was, in its own way, an appeal to solidarity. You were one of us, they wrote. You know the risks we all take. You know that when a man goes into the wilderness, he trusts his crew to bring him back. We do not believe you failed that trust, but we do not understand why you will not tell us what happened. We are asking you as brothers in the work to let us honor them properly. Carver did not respond. One of the men who signed the letter, a surveyor named Thomas Gray, later told a historian that the silence felt like a betrayal, even though we didn't know what we'd been betrayed from. There was one person who did not pressure Carver to speak. Her name was Ruth Ames. She was a school teacher in Concord, 30 years old, unmarried. She and Carver had met in the winter of 1903 at a church social. They struck up a quiet friendship. Ruth was one of the few people Carver allowed into his life during those years. They took walks together. They attended lectures. They spoke about books, weather, small things. Ruth never asked him about the mountains. In a letter to her sister, dated March 1904, she wrote, Daniel is a good man. I believe that with all my heart. Whatever happened to him out there, he is carrying it alone. I do not think he wants to be saved from it. I think he believes he deserves to carry it. Ruth and Daniel were married in October 1904. She kept her silence too. The question of legal action was raised more than once. In 1903, the family of James Whitmore consulted an attorney about the possibility of a civil suit. The attorney, after reviewing the case, advised against it. There is no evidence Mr. Carver acted with negligence or malice. The attorney wrote, his silence, while troubling, is not in itself a crime. A lawsuit would likely fail, and it would cause further pain to all involved. The Whitmore family accepted the advice. But the question lingered. Could a man be compelled to speak? In the United States in 1902, the answer was complicated. The Fifth Amendment protected a person from self-incrimination, but it did not protect silence in a civil matter. A court could theoretically hold someone in contempt for refusing to testify. But Carver had testified. He had appeared at the inquest. He had answered questions. He had simply refused to answer certain questions. And without proof that those questions were material to a crime, the law had no leverage. Daniel Carver's silence, it turned out, was perfectly legal. Over time, the pressure eased. The widows remarried or moved away. The railroad reassigned its crews. The newspapers found other stories. Carver and Ruth settled into a quiet life. They rented a small house on the outskirts of Concord. Ruth continued to teach. Carver continued his clerical work. They had no children. In 1910, they moved to Manchester, New Hampshire, where Carver took a job with a surveying firm that had no connection to the railroad. It was a deliberate severing, a way to escape the shadow of the mountains. For a time, it seemed to work, but the silence was always there. Ruth's sister, in a letter dated 1912, wrote, Ruth says Daniel still dreams. She hears him sometimes in the night, speaking to someone. She cannot make out the words. When she asks him in the morning, he says he does not remember. And in 1918, during the height of the influenza epidemic, when Carver himself fell ill, he was heard by the attending nurse to murmur something in his delirium. The nurse, a woman named Clara Benton, later recounted the incident to Ruth. He kept saying, I couldn't take them all, over and over. I couldn't take them all. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. When the fever broke, I asked him again. He looked at me like he had no idea what I was talking about. Ruth never mentioned it to anyone else. Daniel Carver died on April 3, 1931, at the age of 60. The cause of death was heart failure. He was buried in Pine Grove Cemetery in Manchester, beside his wife, who had passed 2 years earlier. His gravestone bears only his name and the years of his life. There is no mention of the mountains, no mention of the 4 men who did not come home. In the decades since his death, Carver's story has been revisited periodically by historians, journalists, and amateur investigators. Each has tried, in their own way, to solve the mystery. None has succeeded, because the mystery, ultimately, is not one of fact. It is one of motive. The historian Evelyn March, writing in 1967, summarized the case as follows. We know what happened, in a technical sense. 4 men died of exposure in the White Mountains. A 5th man survived. The physical evidence supports this. The medical evidence supports this. There is no reason to believe Daniel Carver caused their deaths. What we do not know, what we cannot know, is why he refused to speak, and that refusal has taken on a life of its own. It has become the story. But I would argue that the refusal was not cruelty. It was protection. Daniel Carver understood something the rest of us did not. He understood that some truths, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. That some knowledge once shared becomes a burden for everyone who hears it. He chose to carry that burden alone. Whether that was mercy or cowardice, I cannot say, but I believe he thought it was mercy. There are, of course, theories. Some believe Carver made a decision, perhaps in a moment of panic, perhaps after careful deliberation, that saved his own life at the expense of the others. That he took the compass, took the last of the supplies, and left them to die. Others believe he tried to save them and failed. That he made a terrible mistake, one he could not bear to articulate. Still others believe the opposite, that Carver did nothing wrong, but witnessed something so traumatic. Perhaps the men turning on one another, perhaps a slow death he was powerless to prevent. that he could not bring himself to describe it. And then, there are those who believe the silence was strategic, that Carver knew if he spoke, he would implicate himself in something. Not murder, perhaps, but something morally ambiguous. A choice that could not be defended in a courtroom or a newspaper, but that made sense in the moment. We will never know which, if any, of these theories is correct. What we do know is this: Daniel Carver was not a cruel man. His life, both before and after the incident, suggests someone who valued decency and quiet competence. He was not prone to violence or recklessness. He was also not a coward. He returned from the mountains. He faced the inquest. He endured the scrutiny, the accusations, the pleading letters. He could have lied. He could have invented a story that absolved him, that gave the families closure, that allowed everyone to move on. Instead, he chose silence. And that choice, I would argue, was deliberate. In the end, the historian's task is not to judge Daniel Carver. It is to understand the limits of what can be known. There are moments in history where the record falls silent, where the testimony ends and the speculation begins, where the truth, if it exists at all, exists only in the mind of a single person who chose not to share it. Daniel Carver's silence was one of those moments, and perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Carver understood that not every mystery needs to be solved, that not every question needs an answer, that some things are better left in the mountains where they belong. In 1953, a logger working near the site where the bodies were found discovered a small cairn, a deliberate stack of stones hidden beneath a fallen spruce. Inside the cairn was a piece of paper, folded and sealed with wax. The paper had deteriorated badly, but a few words were still legible. The handwriting was identified as Daniel Carver's. The visible fragments read, "Did what I could. No other way. Forgive me. The rest is lost." The families never got their answers. The railroad never got its closure. The historians never got their proof. And Daniel Carver, wherever he is still keeping his silence.